So everybody, thank you so much for joining us tonight for the first of our lecture season for this year. This is the Paterson Museum Foundation's Historical Lecture Series, and tonight I am going to be your host. I'm Heather Garside. I'm the curator of the Paterson Museum. The Paterson Museum Foundation is the nonprofit partner of the Paterson Museum, and they help us with so many different projects. They get grant funding for different projects that the museum wants to do, and then they organize and put on this lecture series, which is a great way for us to explore new topics about Paterson's history that otherwise we don't have time to talk about at the museum. So if you are new to the lecture series, we do encourage you to go to the museum's YouTube channel and check out the ones that we've done in the past. We record every single one of the Zooms, and they go up on our YouTube channel usually in a couple of weeks. And you can watch them again. So if you want to, listen to Nancy over and over again, you can after tonight. You can check out some of our others as they come up. And also, I want to encourage you to please consider donating to the Paterson Museum Foundation. We are going to put a link to our PayPal in the chat for you. And if you enjoy our programming, please do consider donating, because that would be a big help for us as we continue to put on this programming. We've been very lucky that most of our presenters, actually all of our presenters, are willing to present for free, which is a huge help, because as I said, we're really just trying to promote Paterson and its history for additional people and for posterity. So as I said, this is the first of our programs that we'll be presenting tonight. And if you are interested, our next two programs are going to be October 10th and November 14th. And they are going to be on October 10th. It's about Senator William Hughes, whose statue is in front of the courthouse in Paterson. And on November 14th, the program will be about the Barber family of the Barber Flax Mill, which is just down the street, down Spruce Street from the Paterson Museum. And both of those programs are going to be very interesting. For a full listing of our programming, we have everybody organized up through April this year, April 2024. So if you're interested, you can find that full listing on our social media pages for the Paterson Museum Foundation. All right, so tonight we are here to learn about Alexander Hamilton and his economic perspective. So I'm very happy to introduce Nancy Spannaus, who's a public historian who has studied Alexander Hamilton since the 1970s. She has a co-edited book about political economy in the American Revolution, which came out in 1977, and she recently self-published Hamilton versus Wall Street, the Core Principles of the American System of Economics in 2019. And that's what her program tonight is going to focus on. And she's going to discuss Hamilton's economic perspective and its long-lasting impact on the U.S. and the world. So I hope you all help me welcome Nancy as she presents to us. And I'm going to just say that if anybody has any questions through the program, just stick them in the chat. You can even stick them in the chat as you think of them. We're going to go through all of our questions and answers at the end of Nancy's program. All right, Nancy, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Heather. Good evening. My subject really focuses on something that is critical to Paterson, actually was part of Paterson's founding, which is Hamilton's devotion to establishing the United States as a manufacturing nation. And the perspective for that was primarily outlined in his report on manufactures. And what I'm going to do is pretty much review an extremely brief synopsis of what is included in my book, which is how the core ideas of Hamilton's report on manufactures and how they were carried out through American history and beyond. In American history, I'm not going to go much beyond Abraham Lincoln, just because, of course, it's a time, but I hope you are interested. Here's a short, unbiased review of my book. You can find others on Amazon. By Leonard Zaks, who very kindly helped to connect me so that I could speak to you tonight. So with that said, here is one of the inspirations, one might even think, for Alexander Hamilton to think about establishing the city of Paterson and a manufacturing powerhouse in the United States. This is the Passaic Falls, a painting representing it very early on in the history of our country. This being a place where Hamilton and Washington and others, I forget who, sat and had lunch in 1777 or so. And Hamilton saw the power of those falls and saw this as a tremendous location for possibly setting up an industrial park of sorts, getting industry started in this country. And that was something that I will indicate when he actually did that, but it is part of what founded your city. So here's the report, an original copy. This was written in December 5th, presented in December 5th, 1791. And I consider it actually the Rosetta Stone of all Hamilton's thinking about economy. Some of his programs I won't have time to go through tonight. I'm going to concentrate on the manufacturing question per se. So that let's take that away. I'm going to deal with that in 3 parts. One will be the leading ideas in the document. The second is how they were applied, very much abbreviated picture of that, in the building of the US economy into the kind of powerhouse that we became, and their international, very briefly, their international influence, which is not over. I mean, none of this is over. One could even make the case for a certain level of Hamiltonian revival today, in terms of a promotion of turning the United States back into a manufacturing nation. So the leading ideas, where do we get those? So they are involved and elaborated as much as they ever were by Hamilton. Hamilton being a man of action, he didn't have time, and dying so young, he didn't have time to do a systematic textbook or, exposition of his political philosophy. He was involved in building a nation and saying what needed to be done to do that. But this report, his 3rd major state report, really is one of the most important documents to come out of the early United States after the Declaration and the Constitution. It has a theoretical section, it has a polemical political section, and it has implementation. 30,000 words, prepared meticulously by effectively what you would call an industrial survey of where Hamilton talked, and his assistants wrote letters to places all around the United States saying, what's being produced there, what is are the perspectives, and so forth. And he put that all together to respond to what was a mandate of the Congress passed in January of 1790, saying, we want you to give us a perspective on becoming economically independent, particularly in the military, but not only in the military field. So this document was presented in December 1791. The congressional record shows it being introduced and then no discussion. That doesn't mean it wasn't discussed, but it means that no formal action on the report itself is taken. Now, what's very interesting about this document is that it begins with an attack on Adam Smith. And you won't find many people saying that but it's right there staring you in the face. It's not by name, of course, but it is an attack. He starts off by saying there are some people who don't think the United States should become a manufacturing nation. And he elaborates what their argument is. And the argument that he elaborates is precisely that being given at that time and in the Wealth of Nations, which was done in 1776, and with which Hamilton was clearly familiar, that is precisely where it comes from. Now, why would he have? Why would this? Do I consider this an attack on Adam Smith? Well, Smith had explicitly in the Wealth of Nations said that the Americans should not develop their manufacturing, that would obstruct their progress toward real wealth and greatness, and therefore they shouldn't try to compete basically with the idea that the British Empire had, that it was the workshop of the world, and we should just send them our raw materials and they would send us the finished product. Well, Hamilton was aware we fought a revolution in some large part in order to get out of that situation. He was also aware that England itself never developed its own manufacturing with a government hands-off policy. So he considered this a fraud, and he explicitly said so in the Report on Manufactures. He says, you know, if we do this, if we need to, in order to live a decent life, to import commodities from Europe, and we have to rely on their market for our raw materials, which they may or may not need, then we will be impoverished. And that is intolerable from his standpoint. So that is the framework for the entire 30,000 word document. And then he proceeds from there to go through the various approaches to the value of manufacturing. The concluding, not that he's against agriculture, or saying even that manufacturing is more productive than agriculture, but saying instead that it's a combination of manufacturing and agriculture. I mean, we all know the vast majority of Americans were wedded to agriculture. We had abundant land. People were anxious to carry out agriculture, but that if we have a manufacturing sector, not only will we be more independent, but we will also aid the farming sector in various ways, some of which I will tell you. And the other reason we have to have the manufacturing is that they mean our independence and security as a country. You don't really have independence politically or militarily if you are dependent economically on the mother country or the enemy country, however which way you want to see it. So he's looked at the history, he studied a lot, well, even in the downtime in the course of the Revolutionary War, and came to that conclusion that we have to have any nation that is going to thrive is going to have all the essentials of national supply. The means of it's going to have to be able to feed itself, house itself, clothe itself, and defend itself by having an economic system that allows it to do that. How does this help agriculture? Well, number one, agriculture provides the raw materials for the manufacturers, and therefore there is a built-in market in order for that to happen. And it will help it flourish. Number two, manufacturing will develop the tools and inventions that will improve the productivity of agriculture. So everybody wins, right? In fact, that's the way that Hamilton and many others who followed Hamilton's system much later viewed the question, despite the fact that they ran into considerable opposition from those who just equated the whole idea of manufacturing with the corruption of the British system. In the course of developing this argument about the need for manufacturing, he does go into theory. He talks about the physiocratic system and what that means, rent seeking versus other kinds of production. And at base, what he is posing is, is agriculture the base of your productivity? Is that what is your wealth? Is trading, i.e. buying cheap and selling dear and making a lot of money, does that represent your wealth? No, what represents your wealth is your ability to increase your productive power of labor. And this happens with mechanization, developing the machines, and mastery of nature, which gives you more and more product for the number of people who are working, improves their living standard, increases the population and the productivity and living of the population as a whole. Now, of course, implicit in that and explicit in Hamilton's statement, and this is the particular argument in favor of manufacturing that first got me so enthralled with Hamilton's economics. Enthralled may be the wrong term. What it made me realize is that his economic thinking was very different from what I got in Economics 101 and you got in Economics 101 in terms of the analysis of the manipulation of scarcity and other kinds of calculations of profit and so forth. Hamilton is saying that central to the development of an economy is the cherishing and stimulating of the activity of the human mind, and that happens through manufacturing. That, of course, you can't have a manufacturing society unless you have people who invent the tools that allow you to manufacture. You've got to have people who are educated. You've got to have them have time to think. They can't be working for 18 hours in the field and then end up developing the new technologies that are required to reduce that kind of life. So this is all there in the report on manufacturers. Now, where does he find? He obviously runs into a lot of grief in terms of pushing this. Jefferson, of course, is very explicit that manufacturers should stay in Europe and we should just be farmers here. And then there's also the question of, does the national constitution allow the government to promote manufacturers, which is what Hamilton is arguing for. He's arguing in particular in his implementation section for tariffs, for certain kinds of incentives, he calls them bounties, to manufacturers to produce what we need, and other kinds of economic means to make sure that we have certain vital industries and that they are supported against any competition coming from other places. So Hamilton is very clear in the report, goes through, we do have the constitutional authority to do this. We do that through the General Welfare Clause of the Constitution. As you probably are aware, the general welfare is a concept and commitment which is unlike, I think, anything else. They are twice in our Constitution. It's in the preamble, and it's in Article 1, Section 8 for the powers of the Congress. So this is, and Hamilton has a very explicitly liberal, he says in another place, a liberal interpretation of this, that to do that, the federal government has, as long as it's a nationally applicable purpose, money can be allocated by the federal government to improve the learning, the agriculture, manufactures, commerce that we need to advance our economy. Hamilton does not go through a lot of other specifics in the report, but he gives some other ideas of what the general authority and potential was. One was that the federal government should be able to be helpful in improving the transportation around the country. This was extremely important. You know how Washington was totally committed to the canals to the west. That was not just for commercial reasons. It was because he was fearful that the West would be pulled off and the country broken up if you didn't have those commercial and social connections. And to have those connections, you needed to have improved infrastructure. You need to have better roads. This doesn't look like such a great road, but Hamilton did talk about how, well, the states could do this in the case of projects and proposals that would interlink the states that were in their common interest. A comprehensive plan could and should be developed. He also mentions, of course, the first Bank of the United States was already in existence at the time that he does the report on manufactures. And he brings that up in the context of countering another argument against manufacturing, which was we just don't have the capital here in the United States. We don't have rich people the way they have in England. So, we have to wait and continue to be raw materials producers only and import our manufactured goods. Said, no, that's not necessary. We have capital. I've created this bank using treasury bonds from our national debt, and it was a commercial bank and able to lend to those who needed to borrow in order to improve their equipment, in order to buy tools for their manufacturing shop, and so forth and so on. In fact, the notes of this bank were one of the ways that you could buy shares in the Paterson project, the Society for Useful Manufactures, which was one of the things that Hamilton did specifically on his own to promote the manufacturing perspective. So we go from that very brief sketch into how these ideas were implemented and who did it throughout the building of the U.S. economy. As I said, basically up to Lincoln, because everything somewhat changes after that. It becomes much more complicated. Plus, it's a long time. So I referenced, and of course you're all very familiar with, the Paterson experiment, which came out of the Society for Useful Manufactures. That was put together by Hamilton at the same time he was producing the report on manufactures for the Congress. And his view was that this would be an industrial park that would both bring skilled labor from Europe and serve as an example for what industrialization should look like in the United States. The Richard Silla has called this an incubator for industry, and in fact, that's the way it ended up. It did not thrive immediately. It came into unfortunate financial shenanigans by some of the people who were in charge. And also it takes a long time to get something. Hamilton already knew this was going to take a while to actually pull this together. But that was one of the examples that he put forward to show what was possible as an alternative to the kind of agricultural society that was being proposed by the other side. Under Hamilton's his time at the Treasury, which goes up to 1795, he also did succeed in getting support for numerous of the industries, sorry about that, that he references in the report on manufactures. The one that was of most significance for him was the iron industry, that being absolutely critical to all forms of industry and economy, the agriculture and manufacturing and defense, obviously. So he did, in the report, recommend raising the tariff. That was done, and we began to have some kind of progress on the industrial front during his period. We also began to have a certain amount of infrastructure built. I spoke before about transportation infrastructure. Another very important aspect of infrastructure was the lighthouse system along the coast, because we were a seafaring nation. A lot of our fishing and commerce required that we have these lighthouses. And interestingly enough, these lighthouses, which were mandated to be taken over by the federal government, actually before Hamilton was confirmed, but he was in charge of it even before he was confirmed as Treasury Secretary. They were public utilities for the benefit of those who went by sea. You were not charged if the lighthouse personnel had to come rescue you or serve you in any particular way. And both Washington and Hamilton paid an enormous amount of attention to making sure that these things were manned by people who were competent because of the importance of the shipping to the United States. There were 2 lighthouses that were completed. Some of them were just taken over from the States. There were 2 that were completed during Hamilton's time. One at Fort Henry in Virginia, and called Hamilton's Light, and this one in Portland, Maine, which is my hometown, so I like it in particular. Now, I mentioned a number of times the resistance, and the key resistor was, of course, Thomas Jefferson. He also being in the cabinet along with Hamilton, and as early as 1792, he is writing memos to himself about we need to condemn the report of manufactures, get rid of this, abolish the Bank of the United States, and so forth. And when he takes over, in 1800, 1801, that is the perspective he goes with. However, he has a faction in his party that thinks that's nuts. That faction is headed by Matthew Carey, who was the Irish immigrant. Carey was a publisher in Philadelphia who published the American Museum, the first magazine to reprint and print to the public Hamilton's Report on Manufactures. And he campaigned tirelessly from the 1790s till his death for Hamilton's perspective, despite the fact that his political party was, for at least the first 20 years, extremely hostile to it. This is saying what I just said. This is the feller. And he really didn't get traction on this among the Democratic Republicans until after the War of 1812, which had shown the devastation of which had shown what a disaster it was not to have followed Hamilton's program, both in the manufacturing side and in the financial side. So in that post-war period, he really goes on a tear in trying to organize manufacturers and the federal government and others to take up the Hamilton perspective, to have tariffs to protect industry, to have the new Bank of the United States support industry, and so forth. And the addresses that he gives to the Philadelphia Society for the Promotion of National Industry are really quite extraordinary, very lengthy, but quite extraordinary. And these are just a few of the quotes where he indicates that political economy, if you don't organize your economy right, you are not going to get the kind of prosperity and human happiness that we want as a country. Industry is the only sure foundation of that. And he has presented the essence and luminous report of Alexander Hamilton, which include the principles of political economy. That he reprinted the whole section of argumentation for manufacturing from the Report on Manufactures in the essays that he carried out. He worked with a lot of other people who actually followed this perspective. One was Nicholas Biddle, who future head of the Bank of the United States, Henry Clay, who championed the American system in Congress. And under the presidency of John Quincy Adams, which is very much denigrated wrongly, the perspective of Hamilton really began to get promoted from the White House. There was the Bank of the United States went to Congress, got authorization to join with local entities to invest in canals. The Army Corps of Engineers was given the authority to help map out new canals, map out railroads. Money was available for developing new industries, to develop new technologies like the anthracite coal industry and so forth. So the Hamilton perspective for a short period of time really came to the fore. However, that got beaten back by the Jackson era, and the torch was carried out by Matthew Carey's son, Henry C. Carey. And he takes up the Hamilton cause in the 1840s, beginning a major publishing and political career to try to get the Hamilton perspective going. In fact, much later he says, if we had followed he didn't say Hamilton, he said if we'd followed the economics appropriate to the Declaration of Independence from the very beginning, we would not, which meant industrialization, we would not have had the Civil War. That was his view. And he played an active role in the Lincoln campaign, Lincoln's moving to the fore, and in his election and his policies as president, which very briefly followed Carey's view. I referenced this concept again against cheap labor, which means not investing in infrastructure, not investing in mechanization, as because it is at the core of what Lincoln based his economics on, as Hamilton based his economics on. So what Lincoln does very much moves to make the population educated and capable of going through an industrial revolution. The mechanization and the spread of scientific agriculture in there. The Land Grant College Act to bring high quality education, not excluding the classics, not excluding the humanities and classics, but very much focused on engineering and agriculture. Unifying the country through the Pacific Railway Act. It's the kind of thing that Hamilton would have been overjoyed about as fulfilling the vision that he had. And a national banking system, which, while it was not a national bank, nonetheless followed the Hamiltonian concept of using government credit, also known as government debt, to support the issuance of a national currency and provide for credit for industry and commerce. As I said, I was pretty much going to stop there. There is a continuation of that concept being put into action dramatically in the next major national crisis we have, which is the Depression. But I just referenced that. You can get more in the book if you want to look at the book. And quickly, this influence was not simply in the United States. The report on manufacturers was sent to Europe immediately upon its production because Hamilton wanted to recruit skilled labor to bring it to participate. The prospectus for the SUM and the report both went there. And partly because the report was known, people began to ask for it. The Russian consul in England asked the American representative there, would you give me a copy? And the Russians, as far as I know, were the first to translate the report on manufactures into their own language by 1807. So they were looking for how to break the stranglehold of British imperialism. So they looked to Alexander Hamilton. Similar kind of motivation behind the Germans, looking at Hamilton's economics. The avenue was through this fellow Friedrich List, who was here in the United States in the 1830s and studying with Matthew Carey. And he took that system back to Germany, which began to implement the perspective of national unity and national industrial unity. And then Japan, which sent in the 1860s delegations over to learn how the United States was proceeding to develop its independence from the British. And in fact, the Grant administration sent an emissary specifically to educate the Japanese on the Hamiltonian American system in the 1870s. Pretty amazing when you think about our history. And therefore, by the end of the 19th century, you could say, in a way, Hamilton's concept had come to fruition, because if you take the parameter of steel production, for example, a major indication of industrial strength, where it had started off with Britain being on top in 1873, by the time you get to the end of the century, we're ahead, the Japanese are ahead, etc. We've become economically independent in one of the major areas. So, and that is, we did that by investing in technological progress, government support and protection for our industry, sovereign credit, and modernizing infrastructure, all of which were ideas starting with the report on manufactures. So we give due credit to Alexander Hamilton, and I will stop there. This is my calling card. You want to take a snap of it. It will put some of that information. It will be in the chat. If you want to get in touch, I encourage you to look at the book. I have read a blog, which has a lot of material, some of which I realized today I'd forgotten about, with emphasis on primary sources. So thank you for listening. And that is, we're
That's
open
great.
for questions.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was such a fantastic presentation. You took something that sometimes can be a bit dry and you made it very, very interesting and understandable. So thank you very much for that. As Nancy said, let's start putting any questions for her either in the Q&A or the chat. We actually had a couple of questions emailed in, Nancy, so I'll ask you one of those so that we can get started. So Leonard asked, why is the report on manufacturing Hamilton's least studied and most misunderstood of his 4 great state papers? It's a loaded question right there.
Right. Well, I don't think I can give you hypotheses. I don't know whether whether I really know. I think there are numbers of reasons. One is sometimes I wonder if people have even taken the time to read it all, because, I mean, of course, today people really don't read as much as they used to, but the it's a daunting document in many respects. So, is it actually read? Otherwise, I think that there was a sort of paranoia about the idea of becoming a manufacturing nation among many people, even the Jeffersonians and so forth. Maybe not Jefferson himself, but others. They associated banking with Britain because Britain had been the banker, and they certainly were not kind and friendly and helpful. And they associated some miserable conditions of manufacturing in Britain, which was not the idea here, but with what might be being proposed. So I don't know. I somehow think that, I mean, when I read it, it just seems so, as I said, so different from an idea of a dry economic document and more of a philosophical document about how to build a country which is strong and productive. And if you're looking at economy from that standpoint, as opposed to as a profession or as an academic discipline, then I think you become much more positive toward it and really want to continue to delve into it, continue to read it, because one reading is certainly not enough.
Of other questions. So Dennis has asked, is the original Portland Lighthouse still in existence?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Well, I don't know whether it's the same lighthouse. I didn't go there this time. I went to Maine this summer, but didn't get to that location. There's certainly a lighthouse there, whether it's a replacement of all those lighthouses. Most of the lighthouses that were built along the coast in Maine, of which I think somewhere between 30 and 50 are still operative or their replacements for the use of the fishermen up there and people out on the water. So I think so, but I'll check it out.
We've got another question. Were there any parts of the report on manufacturing that proved in retrospect to have been an error?
I'm trying to think. Nothing immediately comes to mind. There is one part that people would think is an error, which was that in the discussion of tariffs, obviously Hamilton expected blowback on that question because it would function as a tax, right? He said that you don't have to worry about that because as the technology of production improves, we will cheapen our production. It won't cost as much to produce quality goods, and therefore the prices will be able to come down, despite the fact that you have a tariff to keep the British competition out, right? There are many areas of the economy today in which you would say that's not true. There are some because other factors of financial interference exist. But the area where you can see how I think Hamilton was thinking about it is, say, computers. Right? Computers certainly began as much more expensive, elaborate operation, and as the technology improved, they became much more cheap, like this little thing, this computer. So, but I can't immediately, someone may come up with an example, but I cannot think of one right offhand.
Joseph asks, would Hamilton approve of the Biden administration subsidizing of various industries such as EV production?
I don't know. That involves many. Hamilton, I think he was very discriminating on where those subsidizations should occur in terms of their benefits for society as a whole, and I'm not sure whether that would qualify. I think he would certainly be for a government involvement and support for infrastructure development, which would improve the circulation of goods and people throughout the entire country. And in fact, there is a bill before the Congress to set up an infrastructure bank based on Hamilton's concept of using government debt, private government debt, as bonded capital, as the capital and stock for an infrastructure bank that would put it into that kind of national infrastructure. I'm not sure that that electric cars would be that or not, but that would be a question.
So John Franco asks, why was the report delivered to Congress a year in delay from when it was requested? And if Congress didn't leave formal comments for the record, what were reactions among Americans immediately after it was delivered? Do you think that its reception was tainted by Hamilton's many scandals that were coming out in 1792?
Okay. Number one, it took all that time because he was doing research. He was actually, maybe you missed it, he carried out what would be called an industrial survey to explore who was weaving cotton cloth, what the tanning industry was like, what the iron industry was like. He has about 15 different industries, which he specifically discusses in terms of whether the government should increase the tariff or whether they should have any particular action to encourage their production. And he has looked into and talked to the people all around the country to find out what the state of production and financial sustainability is throughout. So I think that's why. Why was there no particular? Well, this was 1792. Hamilton didn't have any personal scandals in 1792. The personal scandals really, I mean, he had done things that would ultimately become part of personal scandals, but they were not public. There was constant, of course, there was constant attempts by from the Jefferson side to Jefferson. It's true, Jefferson sets up his newspaper and starts accusing Hamilton of being almost a British agent and trying to turn us into the New Britain and all that in 1792. So there is a lot of animosity going on there, but the actual, huge, and there are constant attempts to say that he may be mismanaging the money, but every time they asked for an investigation of Congress, he was able to show that there was no mismanagement of money. And ironically, when Jefferson takes office, the first thing he asks Gallatin to do as Treasury Secretary is, get rid of this financial system. It has to be based on fraud, go search it out. And Gallatin comes back and says, sorry, sir, it's the most perfect system ever devised. So even though I disagree with Hamilton about, industrialization and government investment in various aspects of the economy and so forth. So yes, there was tremendous factionalization, but it was not, but I think it was on the policy issue more than on any personal scandal situation at that time.
The next question is, are there any corporations that were subsidized under the Hamiltonian policy during the Federalist era that made technological breakthroughs? And did people like those at Lowell receive any direct benefits for their industrial operations from the Hamiltonian policies?
Wow.
No light questions for you tonight.
Wow. Some of these questions, perhaps, you'll have to put them in the chat and I'll have to answer them by email, if you really want me to do that. I think Lowell was later. I may be wrong. I haven't looked a lot at Lowell, but I don't think that was subsidized at all. My understanding from talking to people is that was personal wealth by people in that area who established it. Um, I don't think there were any direct subsidies to corporations. What there was, I mean, unless you talk about the Society for Useful Manufacturers, in which there was definitely support. And there was a lot of recruitment of skilled workers. And I don't know of any specific technological breakthrough made at that time, which is related, but I haven't really looked at the question in that particular way. So I can't, I really can't answer it more specifically right now.
So Mickey said that they appreciate your presentation. Does your book address the humanitarian and humane impact on laborers, considering they had free or cheap labor that were not benefited by the government support and subsidy of the industry?
The only way in which my book follows the policy questions of the governments that followed Hamilton's overall idea. And it's much more detailed on the report on manufacturers and all the policy questions that come up than I was able to present to you. And in that, he did have some discussion on labor that is very brief, but I think definitive, because one of the, which I think goes in part to your question, there are those who argued, he goes through a whole series of arguments, encounters a whole series of arguments against manufacturing, one of which was that American laborers paid too much to do manufacturing. So it's much better to do it in Britain, where definitely the standard of living was lower. And Hamilton said, yes, indeed. Well, he says, I'm not sure how much higher it is, but granted it's higher somewhat. But he doesn't say we should lower it. He says we can live with that because we should keep it higher than other places, because number one, we will be eliminating the transportation cost of importing, and number two, increased mechanization, and that there's a certain mechanical genius in this country that should allow us to be able to increase that mechanization. So I'm not dealing, so I don't have much else to say in the book about labor policy per se, as it is certainly the Hamiltonians who followed him were very actively involved in pro-labor activity, including Matthew Carey, and certainly going up to the Lincoln administration. So.
So in your research on Hamilton, did you find any gaps in scholarly research that still needs to be addressed?
Oh, there's always a lot more. There's always a lot more. I don't know whether I could identify what, I've read the entire collected works, and I should probably do it again, because there are letters that because when you read people's letters, you get some sense of what they're constantly involved in, even though a lot of those letters are official, right? They're official to Washington, they're official to Jefferson, they're official to Adams, and so therefore they're not going to be personal reflections. But Hamilton was, of course, extremely voluminous as a writer, as many people were at that time. So, and he hardly held back his opinions about things. So I don't have I mean, I would wish that he said a lot about his disappointments in people's reaction to his plan and to the Constitution. He was very, very worried about that. I wish there were more on his direct view on the slavery question, because while I believe that he, and I have, you know, I firmly believe, and there's all sorts of evidence that is not in his own words of his intent to make slavery extinct by supplanting it with his economic system. You know, he didn't write much about it until, you know, except very early on. You know, he was in correspondence, for example. You know, he responded to a request by Toussaint Louverture to give an idea of what kind of government Haiti should have. But it's an extremely brief letter, and there should be letters around it, right? Or conversations around it with his childhood friend Ned Stevens, who was the consul in Haiti, right? So at this time in the Quasi-War in 1798, Hamilton is not in government, but he's very intensely involved with people in government to getting support for the Haitian Revolution. I would love, you know, if there were more information on that, and there may be somewhere, you know. I don't.
Someone will find a treasure trove of letters somewhere in the attic.
Right. You know,
every historian
that somebody, you know, somebody in Haiti will. My husband has a Haitian doctor. I'll ask him to do, you know, someone can find letters about the discussion of what we should do and so forth. Anyway, I'm sure there were discussions. I don't know where there's documentation, right? And that's a gap, which is very important to me, because I've drafted another book which is on the slavery question and Hamilton. So
we just have a couple more questions. Can you elaborate on why the Hamilton economic model might have prevented the Civil War?
In 25 words or less? No. That's what I've written my new book on. I mean, to be brief, slavery weakened our country. Slavery was an economic cancer on our country, and industrialization was the only way that you could actually have a different system, provide a system of increasing improvement in people personally and people in the country as a whole. You know, I tend to use a quote from Matthew Carey, who says that you cannot have that political economy sets your environment. So what is your political economy? Well, we had two political economies. We had the political economy that Hamilton was trying to assert, which was an industrial economy, you know, that had not that had agriculture, commerce, and industry working in harmony, as later Henry Carey discussed. And we had a slave labor imperial economy, which was reflected in the industries of the primary industries of the South, and which one was, and they were actually fundamentally incompatible in the medium or long term. Obviously not necessarily in the short term, but they were always in conflict, and therefore the only and one of the problems is that even the people who were fighting slavery on a moral basis did not necessarily understand or opposed the idea of making the economic shift, because but you can't have, the way I put it is, you can't have a moral society without a moral economy, and a moral economy meant we had to get rid of that slave imperial system. So Hamilton had established the principles for industrialization and for government responsibility for that. And if that had been carried through, and we hadn't had 20 years, which we had from 1801 to almost in the beginning of the 1820s, was pretty much dominated by the anti-industrial view. And that corresponded with a major increase in slavery's role in our society. You know, start with the Louisiana Purchase, expansion of slavery there. And you know, so I believe that if that obviously the longer that slave imperial economy survived and grew, the more difficult it would be for the industrial economy to peacefully get rid of it. Henry Carey had a plan for it. Lincoln had a plan for it, but that was very late. That was already after we had a horrendous expansion of the evil side of things. So I can't give you the
So to be continued in the next book, right?
To be continued. When the book comes out, if it all goes well, it'll be out by December, and maybe I'll talk about it here again.
That would be fantastic. We would love that. Well, thank you, Nancy, so much for speaking to us tonight. I just want to remind everyone who is tuned in that in your chat is a link to Nancy's book, as well as to her landline, because if we buy the book directly from Nancy, it's better for her. Self-published authors, we got to support them, right? So so if you didn't get a chance to look at that, that'll be in the chat. We will also include that in the description in the video when it goes up on YouTube. So please, if you know people who missed out tonight, encourage them to check it out on the museum's YouTube channel. And if you're new to the Foundation's programming, please, we've been doing this. This is our 3rd season, so go check us out on YouTube. There's lots of videos up there, lots of great Paterson history topics.
So for YouTube, how do you get it? Just put Paterson.
So you can search it as the Paterson Museum, and our channel is usually one of the first things that come up. I also did put that link in the chat as well for anybody who's interested. And we always post that we've put a video up on both our Facebook and our Instagram account, so people know that a new video is up.
Okay.
All right. Well,
Great.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you, Nancy, again for your time. And thank you, Dave, behind the curtain, for covering our IT for us tonight. And we hope to see a lot of you again on October 10th, and that'll be on the program about Senator Hughes. So
Okay,
good night.
thank you very much for listening.
And thank you, Heather.